This is actually going to be a much shorter presentation than Matthew's one, so I don't think we should run over time. What I'm going to present today is actually some of the very initial findings from this 3D printing and intellectual property futures project that Matthew mentioned that I am undertaking, and particularly those findings that are of relevance to the topic of today's workshop. So bioprinting, but probably medical 3D printing more broad, 3D printing in the medical sphere rather than just bioprinting as such. So as Matthew mentioned, my previous research ended up being this book, which did touch upon medical device regulation as well as various other areas of law when it comes to 3D printing and some of the kind of more general socio-legal questions around 3D printing. I'm a socio-legal academic, so my work is generally in law, but with using methods which are not always legal methods. So that book was very much kind of taking that approach. And I looked at developments in, I guess, Western global North countries, particularly English-speaking countries and the European Union, which is quite typical of a lot of the research from law and the social sciences around 3D printing. So my current work is this 3D IP Futures project, which is funded by the UK Intellectual Property Office. We're about halfway through the project at the moment, and we have a multidisciplinary and multinational project team, one of whom is in the audience and will be speaking a little bit later as well. So the idea of this project was to try and get a broader, or create a broader base of knowledge and research on 3D printing, on the relationship between 3D printing and intellectual property, but broadening out the existing research to look specifically at countries outside of those ones that I was looking at in my previous work. So specifically, we have been looking at developments to some extent, yes, in the EU, US, and UK since I published my book, and since some of the rest of us did other work on 3D printing. But what I think is particularly novel about, one of the things that is novel about this project is that we have been undertaking work, research in China, India, Russia, and Singapore as well, to try and understand a kind of more global view of what is happening with 3D printing and intellectual property. The other innovative part of this project, I would say, is the methodology that we're using. So we are conducting innovative horizon scanning workshops with experts in these different countries in order to have a view that goes outside the sort of academic, legal, or academic, strictly academic sort of social science view as well of what is happening with 3D printing and what potential future scenarios might be for 3D printing in general, its relationship with intellectual property, and what advice we may be able to give to the funding body about what they should do around their own policies, practices, and potential lobbying for law reform in the UK as well. So horizon scanning is this innovative methodology we're using is a qualitative social science methodology, and the aim with using this methodology is to move away from technologically deterministic views of the future, to try and kind of understand some of the other factors beyond the technology itself that may shape the relationship between, in this case, 3D printing and intellectual property. And by doing this, we hope to have a kind of better understanding of how that relationship may be progressing and how it may also differ in different places and different parts of the world as well. What we've done so far is we've had a pilot workshop which was completed in Brisbane earlier this year, and we have then undertaken 4 of the kind of main workshops in the locations on this slide. So we, Moscow, or Roorkee near Delhi in India, Singapore, and Shenzhen in China, and that's the photo of the Shenzhen workshop. And we've got 2 more workshops coming up in Paris and London in the next couple of months. What we do with these workshops is that we invite experts, around kind of 10 to 15 experts from different stakeholder groups with some knowledge of 3D printing ideally, or knowledge or experience experience or in a kind of relevant other area. So we have IP, at this workshop we had intellectual property lawyers, for instance, who maybe didn't have a great knowledge of 3D printing, but they could kind of enlighten us as to what was happening in China around the sort of IP discussions more generally, and to what extent they had come across 3D printing. Our hypothesis is that the kind of 3D printing and intellectual property future will be different in different countries. It may have people from different industries may have different views of what that future might look like, and specifically different intellectual property rights, so copyrights, patents, trademarks, design rights, trade secrets, and so on. The kind of future outlook for those rights may be different as well. They may have different futures for copyright compared to patents. I'm going to kind of give some of the broad initial findings at the moment from the tentative findings as well. So that's the big caveat. And then in the next slide, I'll explain some of the findings that are more relevant to medical 3D printing. So firstly, there definitely are some similarities across the different countries we've looked at so far. From what I understand of what the participants were kind of telling me, and in the other workshops as well, no one is seeing a near-term existential threat to the intellectual property system from 3D printing. And that's, I think, quite important given some of the earlier literature around 3D printing, as Matthew mentioned, Mark Lemley, for instance, we're kind of hypothesizing that 3D printing may be kind of fatal to intellectual property laws and practices if they weren't kind of worn down enough by the digitization and the internet. Then 3D printing would kind of kill them off entirely. There would be kind of mass scale infringement, and that this would be sort of uncontrollable. In reality, for various reasons, including the lack of ubiquity of 3D printers in people's houses and workplaces, the lack of kind of functionality of cheap 3D printers and so on, this threat does not really seem to be manifesting itself in reality. So I think that's one important thing, and that seems to be a fairly similar kind of view expressed across the different countries we've been working in. Just to kind of give some of the sort of divergent findings from some of the workshops. For instance, in what we found in China is that people thought that intellectual property litigation around 3D printing would probably increase. There has been some litigation already, but people thought that would actually increase. But while on the other hand, people also thought that if 3D printing was to have a broader take-up, then more open access approaches were necessary. So people identified the expiry of key patents, and actually in many of the workshops, people identified the expiry of certain key patents relating to 3D printing machines as being a kind of very important sort of event for the take-up of 3D printing in that particular country. But certainly in China, on the one hand, people thought there would be more litigation around IP, but also that if there were more open approaches to IP, there would be more take-up of 3D printing. Singapore, interestingly, particularly for this group, people at that workshop seem to think that medical regulation, medical device regulation, safety, regulation, product liability was more important to them and to their functions and their activities than intellectual property. And in Russia, one of the big kind of findings from that workshop was that whereas in other places there did not seem to be particular problems with access to 3D printing design files, for some reason in Russia that was viewed as being a big barrier to take up by people there for 3D printing. And so I think it's interesting for those who may have some experience of kind of the internet and digitization, this idea of the kind of splinternet or balkanization of the internet, where you have kind of different internets in different countries. There may be something similar happening with 3D printing, so different trajectories for 3D printing in different countries, and some of these findings may bear that out, that there are different challenges that people are facing, particularly in the Chinese context. This is slightly of a slight divergence, I guess, that the kinds of places that people are getting content from are quite different to the kinds of places people are getting content from in the West. So there are different companies, different kinds of services and different models, which also it can be compared to the Chinese approach to the internet too, which is quite different. One has quite different actors there than in the West, for instance. Okay, so some more specific findings around 3D printing in the medical sphere. Of the workshops that we've undertaken so far, there seemed to be most interest in medical 3D printing from participants in the Singapore workshop. So we have kind of more material from that workshop around 3D printing, which may be to do with the kinds of people that we had as experts in that workshop. Quite a few of them were working on 3D printing in the medical sphere themselves in various different ways. But also I think that is indicative of the fact that, for instance, in Singapore, there's a lot of money being invested in 3D printing activity and research in the medical field, which participants viewed as being linked to the aging population in Singapore. So the Singaporean government was investing in 3D printing, they viewed as a result of these kind of social or demographic changes, I guess. But interestingly, one of the findings, or one of the kind of comments that was made, was that there was kind of significant barriers to adoption in Singapore of medical 3D printing. So obviously regulatory approval, which I think is a fairly sort of common a fairly common sort of barrier, but also perhaps more interestingly, it was necessary, they viewed it necessary for doctors and other medical professionals to actually kind of accept this technology as being useful, and in their view, that would not, there may be a need to kind of convince those medical professionals that actually using 3D printed parts or would be useful for their medical practice. So kind of resistance or small c conservatism from those people may be our participants viewed as a barrier to adoption of 3D printing in the medical sphere. And also, I mean, I think this is something that's come out from other workshops as well, is that people viewed 3D printing very much as a complementary technology and not a full replacement for existing manufacturing techniques in general, but also in the medical sphere. So it would be used in some cases, but perhaps not in other cases when it's kind of appropriate to whatever object people are trying to print. In our Shenzhen workshop, there was not a huge amount of discussion around medical 3D printing, but one thing that the participants seemed to kind of strongly agree on was that a barrier to adoption there, particularly of bioprinting or printed organs, if we actually get to that stage where they are kind of widely available, people viewed that kind of what they identified as sort of Chinese cultural attitudes around organ transplantation and body modification coming from, I guess, some Confucian ideas about the integrity of the body. They viewed that as being a potential barrier to the general public's acceptance of like 3D printed organs or body parts. Okay, so I'm kind of pretty much at the end now, and I think I just wanted to kind of emphasize that what is the point in talking to experts? Well, I think that we've discovered from talking to experts in different countries that the barriers or getting 3D printing to be used and accepted in the medical sphere is not just a question of technology or law specifically, that there are kind of other things at play which can be government innovation policies, kind of encouraging the particular investment and kind of take up of certain technologies, as we can see in Singapore, but people's kind of attitudes, cultural preferences, and particularly those who are in a decision-making capacity as medical professionals, there may be attitudes that are not so conducive to the take-up of 3D printing, and that might serve as a barrier in itself, which is something that's not really, from what my impression, being discussed in the literature so far around 3D printing and regulation in particular. So I think that it is worthwhile talking to experts to kind of try and understand these kind of perhaps more silent or hidden barriers that may actually kind of shape how the technology kind of continues. Just to say that what's next in this project, we've got a couple more workshops to do in Europe, but around this time next year, we will produce a final report with all of this research in it for the UK Intellectual Property Office, which will be publicly accessible, and we will also probably be engaging or writing some academic publications and doing other outreach activities. But if you're interested in kind of seeing the progress of our project, we've got a Twitter account, 3DPIP Futures, and also a website, which I think is 3dpipfutures.com. And there's also a little bit more information about some of the workshops we've conducted already there.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. question. I know we've got a long lunch break, so if I could get the ball rolling, it's really interesting to see how we collect evidence on attitudes towards 3D printing and indeed what the real issues are. And it brings me back to a paper that colleagues led by Tim Caulfield, one of the leading international commentators on biomedicine and gene patents. They published an article called Evidence and Anecdotes in 2006. And I think that illustrates the issue of when you're looking at opinions, collecting opinions, when do anecdotes become evidence? And we've seen anecdotes there, the surgeon anecdotes on what their views are and the evidence that you can get from talking to experts in the field. So how do we do that? How do we move from evidence to anecdotes in a field like this? And how much indeed should that influence law and policy?
I think one does have to be kind of cautious about, or even the findings that I was presenting as being sort of illustrative perhaps or indicative, but not necessarily the basis themselves to make sort of strong policy around. But I think that certainly in 3D printing there's been a lack of empirical sort of social science research on 3D printing, particularly outside of, I guess, the global north. And so I think kind of building that body of research is important, and the greater the body of research we have, I think the more evidence we may get, but also using different kinds of methods is important as well. So
I think it's a really good question to ask. Shabir from the University of Michigan has a nice comment recently, when people talk about evidence-based policy making, what do they actually mean? Whose evidence and whose views are going to be taken into account? I do think there are some methodological tensions in terms of qualitative versus quantitative approaches. I think the work of Dr. Daly really highlights the great value and significance of doing empirical research, doing interview-based research and workshop-based research in looking at what is happening in relation to certain sorts of technologies. We've learned from what has happened with the FDA and the TGA that bureaucratic knowledge sometimes is inadequate and limited and has its own biases, and we need to take into account that as well. But I think for new technologies there's an interesting weave there in terms of having to consider all sorts of cultural discourses around a technology as well. And in relation to 3D printing and bioprinting, you have at one and the same time a very kind of utopian discourse. So we just have a new book by Mark Hatch, which is just next to you, hiding under there, about the maker revolution, which is very enthusiastic about 3D printing and bioprinting and how it will reshape manufacturing and innovation and healthcare. And then you have some quite dystopian discourses as well, like Westworld is one of those, but you certainly have some very fearful discourses in relation to new technologies. And I do think it's kind of important to engage with those and kind of sort out sometimes what they're tapping into. Is it factual? Is it fantasy or fictional? So I think a multifaceted approach is a good one. Sometimes anecdotes are really important in terms of they represent larger conflicts. So the myriad litigation was often dismissed of is only a particular dispute. But patents are so powerful, they can really affect whole marketplaces in certain sorts of ways. So I think a case study approach is sometimes really useful and helpful to work out what's going on. But good questions in terms of methodology.
Yeah. Any other questions from the audience? Kate?
I have a question for Matt. You finished off saying that maybe the answer is more regulation. And I was wondering how confident you are that regulation imposed on these technologies will be through regulation. Does that require a fair bit of faith in our system?
Well, I think the history of science and technology has been a very mixed one in relation to regulation. So in your own discipline of copyright law and intermediary liability, there have been instances where there's been premature regulation of an area. So our rules in copyright law are based on 1990s internet, before search engines and social media and a whole wide range of other things became important. So it is possible to prematurely try to regulate an area and over-regulation to have some quite adverse impacts. I think there are also problems of a very laissez-faire approach to regulation, of just hoping and wishing that the marketplace will sort things out. And we've seen in relation to genetics and bioethics that that hasn't been the case. So sometimes you can have issues in terms of late regulation as well. There's always tensions, I think, that are coming out from all the presentations thus far between technology neutral approaches and technology specific approaches and technology contextual approaches in relation to regulating 3D printing. And our pure hopes for a technology neutral approach have always been thwarted one way or another. So I lack confidence in terms of levels of regulation, but that is also related to questions about the evolution of regulation. So having been at the ANU and being taught by Peter Drahos and John Braithwaite, there's whole bodies of research on regulation and co-option of regulators and the difficulties of ensuring independent, autonomous, responsive regulators. Nonetheless, I think it's still worthwhile fighting for there to be good regulators in the space. And I guess my plea is also, you know, public knowledge have been very good at trying to preempt a lot of the concerns about 3D printing in the United States Congress by having sympathetic legislators, doing early interventions. You know, I think the big danger for 3D printing or bioprinting, I don't know what Dr. Angela Daly thinks, is that it will have a crisis of a dangerous product, particularly in the health sector, which will undermine trust and confidence and lead to the field being affected. And we've seen that in past disciplines. So stem cell research made lots of promises that weren't fulfilled, badly affected by fraud. Biotech, that's been a big problem in terms of over-promising, very slow to produce the kind of benefits. But I think they're really good questions to ask. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Get the next question, just to keep things rolling on, if that's all right, Angela. Yeah.
So my question to Angela, I want to ask you about whether you're thinking of extending your research to other countries, mainly because you have spoken about emerging economies, China and India. So what about these developing countries? Do you think that we should get into the wagon of regulation, or they just wait? They need to wait and see what will be the development taking place in other countries, and think about other methods of regulation. And one more thing, do you think it's a good idea to differentiate your regulation, whether you are a user of technology or you're a importer of technology? Do you think this should be taken into consideration if you're thinking about all of those regulations happening overseas and you want to have them as well, but at the same time you need to have more kind of development perspective into your own laws and regulation? So how do you feel those issues should be dealt with in relation to regulation? Especially, and I think it's a good idea just to look broader, because there are many countries which are now just importing, but they are not having any kind of technology, and it would be interesting to see how those countries will shape the future of regulation around this area.
Those are two huge questions. To answer your answer your first question, I would be really interested to do more work on this, but in the confines of this project, those are the countries that I mentioned are the only ones that we're looking at. I think there definitely could be quite a different story in non-BRICS countries in the global south, which with regards to 3D printing. Also, I mean, and Singapore is obviously a non-BRICS country, but it's a very wealthy economy as well. So, I mean, I think there's a lot more work to be done to kind of understand what is happening elsewhere, which there's almost no information about. There is a project in, I think based in South Africa, which is looking a bit at 3D printing kind of in South Africa, some of the legal and regulatory issues around that, and perhaps in some other Southern African countries. But that's the only one I know about, which is kind of looking elsewhere. I'm not going to give a very good answer to, I suppose, your other questions, because I don't really know enough about it. I do, from the little that I do know, I think there is a concern that I mean, actually I wrote about this in my book, where, or a little bit about it anyway, where you have kind of, I suppose, development projects using 3D printing in the medical sphere, in fact, where there is not proper kind of regulation or oversight by kind of medical professionals, and there's a potential for, particularly prosthetics, in fact, to be kind of used and distributed that are not safe enough. And I know some of those projects are kind of doing that in developing countries. So I think safety remains a big concern kind of internationally, but I have to say I don't really know enough to kind of answer your question very well, and perhaps you know more, in fact, given your work on development. But I think definitely an interesting issue that should be.
I think ethical issues are really important as well, and also lots of talk about other social, cultural issues, especially as Matt said. Maybe he has some.
I think you make excellent points. At the beginning of this year, we had the Honourable Michael Kirby come along and talk about intellectual property and access to essential medicines. And his point was that there are very fundamental issues there in terms of human rights and sustainable development. And he was very concerned about the history of conflict over access to essential medicines. So it's certainly something that we need to keep in mind in terms of the next generation of developments in relation to biotech, because it will make a huge difference in terms of, will the products of bioprinting just be available for a wealthy elite in developed countries, or will they be available in some of these mid-tier countries that Angela has been investigating? What about small island states and least developed countries? If you kind of take the approach of the importance of universal health care, those are really important issues to consider. In relation to 3D printing, there's often an open innovation culture, and at the moment there's a real struggle for the soul of 3D printing and bioprinting about whether it's going to go down a commercial route or a much more open access route. And I think there are some important considerations. But fortunately, we have a leading expert on 3D printing and development next. So
Yeah,
I don't want to steal his thunder.
Can I just add one more thing? And I also don't want to preempt Thomas's presentation too much, but one thing that has been kind of discussed is the potential for 3D printing to kind of be a leapfrog technology for countries that maybe don't have sort of centralized kind of industrial manufacturing, in the same way that mobile phones have kind of been a leapfrog technology in places like India, where where at least there was not kind of a wired telecoms network throughout the whole country, or accessibility throughout the whole country. So there was not, unlike perhaps in the kind of industrialized global north countries, which went from kind of like a wired telephone network then to mobile phones, that kind of intermediate step can sometimes be surpassed. There has been a lot of discussion about 3D printing being used to kind of surpass sort of its large industrialized factories, but to what extent that's actually happening, I think, is a good question.
That's great, and it just shows again, as in the last session, we've got huge questions that are presently unanswerable, but that doesn't mean that we should not try to answer them. And it's good to have the discussion about what the pressing questions are that we really need to focus on over the coming years. So really great presentation by both of you. Thank you, and please join me in thanking both.